Hey, what's up, Seekers? Welcome back. In today's class, we have an epic discussion of the Ten Sefirot in Kabbalah and how they come into existence, what part they play in the divine process of creation and in our own creative processes. And I hope that within the next hour, you'll have a bit of a better picture of what these Sefirot mean. The video which I took was from a live class. It was outdoors at night, and the lighting is not the best, but the audio is pretty good. I hope you forgive me. And I think the content is also pretty good and engaging, and I hope that you enjoy it, and I hope that you can get past the poor visual quality and learn something from the class. And I hope that you have some questions that you come back with, that you follow up down in the comments, so we can continue this discussion and continue to learn together. If you're into Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, universal mysticism, comparative mysticism, philosophical mysticism, you're in the right place. Check out the rest of our content here at the channel and make sure to subscribe, like, and share it with a friend. Much love. With no further ado, here's the class. A heart of the Kabbalistic system is the Sefirot, the 10 Sefirot. Now, what are the Sefirot? I hear people asking silently. They are the crux of the Kabbalistic system. Now, the Sefirot are more than one thing. The Sefirot, simply said, are a map. And maps map simultaneously multiple things if they're very good maps. A very simple map only covers one terrain, but a very good map can teach us about different systems and can map us different realities. So the Sefirot are a schema, a map of reality, firstly. The Sefirot, according to the Kabbalists, is the basic map of the basic fundamental building blocks of reality. The world we inhabit, the world we live in, is made up of the Sefirot. Literally, according to the Kabbalists, like in modern physics, we use a language, we use metaphors, we use maps, we use words like quarks and atoms and electrons and neutrons. If you go down to that level, nowhere on the electron does it say electron made in China. These are maps that we use, the map of modern physics. The Kabbalists had their own map of reality, and the map was the map of the Sefirot. And they use it to explain everything in the ontological, in the physical realm. And we'll explain how that happens and what that means. I just want to give you an overview of where we're going. Number two, the Kabbalah said that the Sefirot not only tell us about the physical world, they tell us about our internal world. Because according to the Kabbalists, the human being is a microcosm of the world, which is the macrocosm, which means anything that happens in the Olam Gadol, in the big world out there, the world that we know, is reflected and is mirrored in the human psyche, in the internal world of the person. And therefore, the Sefirot, just as they map the external world, they also map the internal world, the psyche, the soul of the person. That's number two. Number three is the Sefirot are a map of the divine, of God. Now, what this means is, to try and give us a sense of what that means, because this is a very bizarre statement, the Kabbalists perceived God, like all good Jewish theologians, as something which was infinite, all-powerful, all-loving, almighty, all-knowing. There were no words which one could use to describe God. Even words like almighty, according to many Jewish thinkers, was not appropriate to say about God. One could only speak about God in the negatives. God was not lacking. There was nothing which God did not know. Even to say that God knew everything was to try and put some sort of limitation and label on God, which we cannot do. That is God, but that God of that magnitude, of that stature, is too transcendent, is too abstract, is too infinite, is too beyond to have any relation to the world, to us seemingly. And in order to schematize, in order to understand the relationship between God and reality, the Kabbalists gave us the map of the Sefirot. That God manifests God's infinite essence through the channels of the 10 Sefirot, which we will say what they are in a second. And those Sefirot are the way that we turn back and see God. The example that's used is if one is inside a house and there are different colored windows with stained glass, different colors, and different lights are shining into the house. You have an orange light shining through the window kitchen because the window is yellow. You have a blue light shining through. These different lights, these different apertures, these different frames are like the prisms that are refracting the infinite light of God. The infinite light of God is the sun, as a metaphor. You cannot stare into it. You blind yourself. You cannot even be outside for too long. You'll burn to a crisp. So God, so to speak, filters God's light through these apertures, through these prisms, and when white light goes through a prism, it shatters into a rainbow of lights. And that's what the Sefirot are. So Sefirot initially a map of reality, a map of the human psyche, and a map of God. 3 things so far. We good? Very good. Now, how do these Sefirot come into being? How did this Sefirot come into existence? I took the liberty of doing some arts and crafts today because we have Corona and everyone's stuck home. I'm going to show you my arts and crafts project to explain just how God created the world. Very simple. In philosophy, we call this the earliest cosmogony or theogony, because we're talking about the creation of the divine sphere as well. So what do we see on this white paper? We see nothing and everything, full potential, emptiness. The Kabbalists tell us that before God, this is slide number 1, don't worry, there's more exciting arts and crafts coming in a second. The Kabbalists tell us that before God created the world, there was nothing but God. All that existed was God. That is represented by a blank white page. There's no delineation, there's no limits, there's no lines, there's nothing, just God. Now, I'm going to talk about 2 levels here simultaneously. We're going to keep flipping back and forth. There is what happens in the divine realm, in the process of creation, in God's world, in the life of God, so to speak, and what happens in the human realm, because the Kabbalists tell us that this whole story is not just a nice story for us to understand God, it's a story for us to understand ourselves, and us to understand our relationships, and us to understand our own creative processes. Because God, in the act of creation, is doing something creative, and God, in the act of making the world, is doing something to build a relationship with us, with humans, with the other that doesn't exist before creation. And it's an act of self-expression. So we're going to be flipping back and forth between the divine realm of creation, relation, self-expression, manifestation, and the human inner world of creation, manifestation, relation, self-expression. So, having said that, what is the stage for the human? For the human, this stage depends. If we're talking on a relational stage, there is a relational place where one is a total bachelor. There is no one on the page. There's no consideration, there's no children, there's no wife, there's no girlfriend, there's no boyfriend, there's no lover. One is a free bird. No limits, no constraints, nothing. That's in a relational sense. In a creative sense, if anyone here has done any creative projects, any writing, anything creative at all, when one first sits down at a page, it's the sheer possibility that actually makes the creative process impossible. When you can, if you're going to write a poem, if you're going to sing a song, and you can say anything, you can make anything out of the alphabet. What are you going to do? You're lost in the space of complete potential, which is crippling sometimes. Sometimes we need a creative constraint. And God, so to speak, is in this space of complete unbridled potential, of complete unbridled unlimitedness. Okay? What happens is God needs to make an act of self-restraint, of imposing a self-creative limit. Now, this is very tricky because God, by definition, is the unlimited. But God is so unlimited that God can choose to limit God's self. And metaphorically, we have the power to limit ourselves as well. We have the power to take away the power for us to do anything so that we could do something. Because if you could do anything, if you could do anything, you're not going to do anything. And what God does, according to the Kabbalists, and here we have it represented in this nice pictograph, is God makes a Tzimtzum, a word which some of you may be familiar with, famously taught by the 16th century Kabbalist Isaac Luria, not far from me actually here, just 4 hours north in Tzfat. What God does is God contracts God's own presence, because while God is fully filling the stage, there is no room for other. Nothing else can exist in the presence of God. If anything else even was thought into existence, it would be obliterated in the infinite presence of God. So what God does is God either contracts into a point or creates a vacuum, often described in 2 different forms, where there is now a place which is void of God, which is empty. God, so to speak, does not exist. God, the consciousness, the awareness of God is void from this place, from the Tzimtzum. And this is what happens when we make an act of creation, an act of relation. We must create a space for the other. If we want to have love in our lives, if we want to make room for a child, for a teacher, for a student, any kind of relationship that we're building, we have to take a step back and not fill the entire space. If we don't know how to keep our mouth shut and we don't know how to create a space for silence, then we're never going to hear the other person. But that's the point of this. God is creating a space for conversation. And that is what we do in relationships. We create a space for conversation. We close our mouths. We take ourselves out of the center of reality and we make space for someone else. And in our creative processes, we have to take away what we know and void a place where there is now a small area which we're going to act. We now know, I want to create something using these particular tools, using these particular, whatever it is. And what happens in this creative space? Am I moving too fast, or is this good pace? Because we could slow down. Good. Okay, I have a nod. Fantastic. And we're getting, by the way, we're getting to the Sefirot. This is all just preliminary, and trust me, each one of these stages has immense depth and immense genius, and we can spend definitely a whole class, if not many classes, on each of these stages, which we just skipped over so quickly. But we're getting somewhere, getting to the Sefirot, so we have that in mind. What happens is, how's this beautiful picture? What happens is God re-enters. God, symbolized here by the white void, the light, as the Kabbalists call it, or in Sof, the infinite light, re-enters this hollow place, often referred to by the Kabbalists using the symbolism of a womb, because one of the relative and creative processes which are basic to any life and any existence is the sexual metaphor, and for the Kabbalists this was a key metaphor. So the Kabbalists refer to the empty space, the mokom halal, the creates paleo, the tzimtzum, as a womb, as the empty space, and it begins to take on a feminine depiction. We see here now a polarity being created, masculine and feminine, left and right, and we're going to see how that comes into play more strongly. But this is still at a very early amorphous stage, where so far there's still nothing but God. So there still isn't an other, there still isn't, as the Kabbalists call, still isn't a schema, there still isn't even a feminine aspect of the divine, that they haven't even had that split yet. But going back to this point here, what happens is God re-enters the makom halal, re-enters the place that was made void, that empty place, in a relationship. Once you've made space and you've allowed room for the other, for the partner, now you can re-enter that space carefully and in a measured way. If God reflooded this space with his full infinite presence, his full infinite light, it would cease to exist, and it would make void the void which God created, right? God creates a void, and God wants to hold on and maintain the illusion of the absence of God from that place. So what God does is God re-enters that void just with a very small metaphorical beam of light. And we can see here, if we think about the human aspect, there is a metaphor of the masculine, which is linear, and the female, which is circular, but we're going to hold it off until we get more into that. What happens when this happens both on the divine realm and in the interhumanal and on the personal realm? What happens in the creative process? One brings a bit of thought, a bit of inspiration, a bit of light back into the emptiness. According to the Kabbalists, what happens is, can you guys see this? What happens is there is an emanation. The light hits the center of the void, and the light begins to concentrically expand outwards. Now, according to the this is a very interesting idea. According to the Kabbalists, creation happens in a few stages, and surprise, surprise, not all of the stages are successful. They don't all work out, which seems very odd. It's God who's doing this, and there's no one to interfere. Why wouldn't it work out? But perhaps the reason why there are failures here, which we will talk about at this stage, is because God wants to teach us a process in our own creative processes, that there are failures in our own creative process, in our own self-expression, in our own relationships. And by analyzing the failures of the creative process, we can understand how to do them better next time around. But this was a very fascinating idea that captured many Kabbalists, the failed stage of creation. And what is this? This is the stage of circles called the Kabbalists, the Igulim. Igul is circle in Hebrew, Igulim, plural circles in Hebrew. And what happens is we have the very, very first manifestation of this Sefirot, what we've all been waiting for. In the very, very center, we have Malchut, the lowest Sefirah, and we'll explain what each one means. And when we get to a later slide, followed by Yesod, Hod, Netzach, Tiferet, Gevura, Chesed, Bina, Chochma, Chesed. But what happens is, at this stage of creation, at this iteration of this Sefirot, at this take, the Sefirot are built as in a way that you may not recognize them if you recognize, popular Sefirot artwork. If you've ever seen the graffiti in Tzfat, the Sefirot are built here in circles. They're built concentrically, expanding from the center. God, so to speak, hits the center point and ripples outwards. What this means is that the Sefirot are all in a harmony. They all have equal balance, and they can all equally see one another. And seemingly, that's a great idea. When we're doing a creative expression, all of our potentialities and all of our powers should be expressed with equality and with fair distribution. But what happens is this creation does not work. And what we get is, and here we're going to see some impressionistic artwork. We have the Shevira. We have a big mess. because everything just shatters. It just falls to pieces. It just explodes, metaphorically. What happens? God is creating existence. He makes his first stage of Sefirot, the first act of self-expression, of relation, and it totally shatters. The Kabbalists tell us a very, very important psychological and spiritual lesson, which is that because the Sefirot were all created equally, with equal space on the page, with equal expansion, they were not able to see and communicate with one another. They weren't able to be structured in a way where there could be communication and conversation in a way that was orderly, in a way that went from top to bottom, from bottom to top. It was all, everyone was just talking to everyone. Can you imagine if right now all of these mics were off mute and everyone was just talking at once? That's what the first realm of the Sefirot were. There was no order. There was no one moderating. There was no beginning. There was no end. There was no sequence. There was no structure, and that does not work. And that is a lesson for us in our own spiritual and creative and relational lives, that when we try and bring all of our being right away into our projects, when we're trying to create something and we just throw all of our energy, all of our passion, all of our emotion into it, or into a relationship, we overwhelm the process, we overwhelm the project, we overwhelm the partner, the child, the lover, the spouse, the student, we overwhelm them because it has to be done slowly, methodically, and structurally. So that is the lesson which, so to speak, God learns and which we learn from God's process. And what happens is that we, after the shattering, oh, can we see this next piece of artwork? I had so much fun drawing these today. I hope you guys all enjoy them. We have a crystalline structure where from the chaos, from these scattered elements, to use a scientific term, sets a crystallized form. And the Kabbalists tell us that there are infinite points of light in this new crystalline structure. Now, this language that we're using is highly metaphorical, and if anyone actually believes for a second that in the divine process there's an actual space with points of light and crystalline processes, the Kabbalists tell us you have committed an act of heresy, because these are metaphors. And if we don't want to be heretics, we have to try and unpack these metaphors and see what their spiritual and psychological import is, and not be caught up on the metaphors. But because the Kabbalists speak in metaphorical language, and that is the modus operandi of the Kabbalists, we're going to use that language, but not to get caught in that language. Going back to the story, going back to the metaphor, there is a state of crystallization where there still is no action. And what happens, tell us the Kabbalists, is that God re-enters this place. God, Choser Meir, says the Zohar, God re-enters, like to talk about the human, because we're going to keep switching back and forth, in the human relationship. If one pours all of their energy, if one pours all of their being into the relationship, and it's overwhelming, and the partner, the student, the child, the teacher, the friend, the neighbor says, I can't take it, it's too much, or the creative process, there's no capacity to have anything concrete, one has to take a step back, see where one went wrong, see the mistake which one did, and there's a moment of pause in creation where God pauses to see, why didn't that work? Why didn't the circular formation work? Why didn't me just giving everything as I had it work? And God takes a step back, and only after taking a step back does God return with, again, a small quantum of light. And light, again, being a metaphor. Let's not forget that. What happens is, and here we're going to start to see this throughout as we know them, is from these infinite points on this crystalline structure, God chooses 10 to manifest God's self in, because too many is no good, too little is no good. 10 is the right number. 10, say the Kabbalists, 10 and not 9, 10 and not 11, 10 is the perfect number. And we're going to see that 10 is a very strict number, and it cannot be less, cannot be more in a second. And what we have here briefly, I'm actually going to go to the next slide so we can see it a bit clearer and bigger, and this may be more recognizable. How's that? Who recognizes this, by the way? Who recognizes this little picture? Good. What we have here is we have the 10 Sefirot as we know them, 10 Sefirot round 2, in the order as they're known as Yosher. Now they're in lines, they're in order. As you can see, there's a left line, a right line, a center line, there's order, there's structure, and it's not just chaos, it's not just all of the energy put in. Now that we've come to the Sefirot as we know them, we're going to talk about the Sefirot. And what I want to do with you is, I'm going to teach you this Sefirot the way that I was taught them in yeshiva by my Kabbalah teacher, my Hasidic teacher. So this is one way of understanding the Sefirot, and there will be other teachers teaching you other ways. So see if you like it. And this is a map. It's a map to work with. It's a map to utilize. It's a map to mold and to understand our own experience and our own creative process and our own relative process to see what we can get out of it. If the map doesn't work for you, then find a new way of reading it. But here we have this Sefirot, and we're going to explain briefly what the actual Sefirot are. So firstly, Keter, the very top Sefirah, literally translated. There's something very bizarre, by the way, which is that the literal translations of all the Sefirot are the least helpful translations. It's almost not even worth mentioning them, but we'll say them anyways because that's the names they were given. Perhaps they were given these names just to make them more difficult to be understood. Keter literally means crown. Crown, metaphorically, these are all metaphors that have to be teased apart. They're like puzzles, little games. The crown sits on top of the head. That's where crowns sit, right? What is on top of the head in the human? I mean, hair, a hat, a scarf, a beanie. The Kabbalah say, no. On top of the head is the superconscious. We know from modern psychology, we have the idea of subconscious. There's something that's beneath, something that's unknown, the unconscious. But the Kabbalists say that besides for just the conscious and the subconscious, there's this superconscious. And the Kabbalists say that in the superconscious is generally a space of drive, will, desire, all the aspects which we ourselves are not clear and aware of. We're not aware of our own motives, but they are the real things that push us forward in life. They're the real things which leak down into our brain and drop down and say, we get an idea all of a sudden, we want to do something. We're not going to break down each one of these throughout. I promise you, we could spend just an hour explaining Keter. Keter is divided into two parts, upper and lower Keter. It's divided into three sections. There's Galgaltin, Chochma, Stama, Radlo. We're not going to talk about any of that. We're just going to give the basic structure because I think the basic structure is the first and most important thing. After we have the superconscious, after we have this place, this unknown place of desire, of will, of this primordial drive, we have, when I point to the right side, we have Chochma. Chochma, translated as wisdom. Chochma is the drop and inside of wisdom. We're going to quickly translate them all, and then I'm going to give you a fantastic schema to understand this. Bina, translated as understanding. Daat. Now, if you could see Daat here, is actually not fully drawn in. It's just in circles. Does anybody know why Daat is not drawn in? Did I get lazy and not finish drawing Daat? Why isn't Daat drawn in? Daat is not drawn in because if you count all this Sefirot, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. How many Sefirot are there? There is 10 and not 9, 10 and not 11. So Daat is problematic. And the reason why Daat is not fully lined in is because the Kabbalah teaches us whenever we count Keter, we do not count Daat. And whenever we count Daat, we do not count Keter. There's a very simple reason for this. It sounds very arcane and very abstruse. It's very simple because Daat, the next Sefirah, is real knowledge. When knowledge sits in and it becomes something which we have control of, which we internalize, we make part of us. Now, Daat, having a bit of knowledge, which is you're fully aware and conscious of, is the exact opposite of Keter, which is the knowledge which you cannot tap into, which you cannot touch. And therefore, you cannot have both simultaneously. You can either be in a place of inspiration, of detachment, of just sheer unbridled energy and inspiration, or you can have Daat, you can have something manifest. And that's why we don't count the two of them. We're going to run through all this right, and then I'm going to give you the fantastic schema, and then we're going to dive way deeper into each one. Chesed, loving kindness, paralleled by Gevura. Gevura, strength, justice, judgment. Tiferet, literally beauty, harmony. And we're going to explain what is going on, don't worry. Netzach, literally victory. Hod, literally splendor, Hebrew translation. Yesod, literally foundation. Again, a bad translation. And then Malchut, literally kingship. Now, if kingship and splendor and glory didn't help you understand the Sefirot, don't worry, we're about to understand them. And what we're going to do is, I'm going to take a red pen, and I'm going to show you that by drawing some simple lines on this already very beautiful structure, we're going to make a lot more sense of it. Is this dark enough? Can we see what's on the page here? Yes? Fantastic. Okay. What we're going to do is, we're going to draw 1, 2, 3, 4. Left, right, center. Okay. Now, we're going to see something very, very cool here. That there are 3 channels of expression, 3 modalities of being, which are epitomized by the left, right, and center. And what happens in the left happens for all of the left Sefirot. What happens in the right happens for all of the right Sefirot, and what happens in the center happens for all of the center Sefirot. And once we understand the texture and the flavor of left, right, and center, we'll begin to understand this whole system. This is one way we're going to mark up the page. I'm going to show you soon, when we get to the second stage, that we're going to draw horizontal lines, and I'm going to explain you the next level here. We're going to take this one level at a time. So level 1, we had the basic overview. Level 2 is the channels, the columns, the kavim, as they're called by the Kabbalists. Now, what happens in the left, right, and center is like this. The right is always, according to the Kabbalists, is always giving, is always sharing, is always saying yes. Love is expression, expansion. Left is the opposite, is contraction, is minimizing, is holding back, is saying no, is making boundaries and rules and regulations. That is the nature of left. The nature of center is to find a balance, to find a harmony between the two. Okay? Now, it's actually quite fascinating that the Sefirot is split into left, right, and center, because in the world as we know it, in biology and in chemistry, we have as well a similar process of left, right, and center. Those who are familiar with the left, right, and center of the helix of the DNA, the very structure of reality is structured into these alternating left, right, and center. In the brain, we have right brain, left brain, and we have the center. We have the corpus callosum, which holds the two together and connects them. I want to say, very interestingly, the Kabbalah system, in a way, reflects these neurological, chemical, basic structures. And when I said that the Sefirot are the basic building blocks of reality, you'll now understand why this map may be more accurate and more true than anyone would have believed a map coming from who knows how many hundreds and thousands of years ago. Okay, so what is left, right, and center all about? On the right side, we begin with Chochma. Chochma, we translate before as wisdom, but Chochma is better translated as insight. Chochma is a burst of inspiration when we have the initial inspiration in Keter, which we're not really going to talk about because it's right now, because it's a whole other conversation for itself. But when we have that bit of inspiration, that bit of light, that bit of energy, that bit of passion coming from Keter down into Chochma, we have just a burst of wisdom. If one, for example, a metaphor that's used is that one is standing over a forest, and the forest is pitch black. They can't see anything. And that is the state of their brain, the state of their creative process, the state of their relationship, whatever it is. And then all of a sudden there is a lightning bolt, is a metaphor that's used. And the lightning bolt, for a brief second, lights up the whole terrain. And the whole forest is, for a split second, as visible as day. In our own creative processes, in our own relationships, in our own modalities of self-expression, we see sometimes darkness, we see a forest, we don't know how we're going to go about building this relationship, how we're going to go about building a process, how we're going to go about sharing an idea, and then all of a sudden, there's a burst of light, this burst of inspiration, and everything is clear. We see exactly how it's going to get done. We see it all, but it's transitory. It's a burst, and then it's gone. And what has to happen is, for the creative process to make it down to Malchut, which is the final expression, the final manifestation, the final articulation, every single one of these steps has to be done in order and correctly. And that is the process which we are doing now spiritually, from Pesach until Shavuot, from Egypt until Sinai. And we're going to explain how this process happens. Watch this very carefully. And if any of these processes, if any of these steps get messed up, we have a shattering, like we spoke about. We have a burst of inspiration, Chochma, but because it's on the right side, remember the right is giving, the right is sharing, the right is expansive, the right is unbridled, the right is not contained. We have to do something and take that vision of Chochma, that point of inspiration, and move it across to Bina, move it across to the left. What happens in Bina is a place of detail, a place of logic, a place of analysis. Bina, by the way, the left side is feminine and the right side is masculine. And it may seem counterintuitive to some people, but we're going to see perhaps why this is more true than we would assume. The left side is logical, is analytical, takes the inspiration of Chochma, takes the burst, and begins to give it detail, begins to say, how is this going to work? How am I going to take that inspiration? How am I going to take that burst of insight and make it real? And Bina says, Bina has to hold back. Bina cannot just be the same passion as Chochma. Bina cannot say, I'm going to throw in the whole lightning or else you burn down the forest. Bina says, no, we need to find where it ends and where it begins. That's why Bina is, according to the Kabbalah, the letter Hey. The letter Hey has a top, a left, a bottom. It has a shape. It's like a square. Bina is quite square. It wants to know where things end and when things begin. It wants things to be defined. Chochma is a yud, is just a point, just a flash. What happens when Chochma and Bina interact well together? When there is both a shared reciprocity between the inspiration and the delimitation and the definement, what happens? We have Daat in the middle. The middle beam, the middle center pole is whenever the right and left work in harmony, they're able to channel that energy, channel that expression down to the center to work its way down to the bottom. Daat, according to the Kabbalists, is situated where we have right brain, left brain, Chochma, Bina. We have Daat is situated in the throat, according to the Kabbalists. Why is it in the throat? Because Daat is where we take things from the brain, from the conceptual, and we begin to move it down into the emotions. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to draw our next set of lines, the horizontal lines, and we're going to understand what this is all about. Can we see? Boom, boom, boom. And there we go. Now we have our map building up quite nicely. So where does Keser, Chochma, Bina take place? Where does it all take place? That all takes place cognitively. It's all cerebral. It's all in the brain. It's all up here in thought. Daat is beginning to move down into the body, into the torso of the Sefirot. The Sefirot, besides mirroring God, the world, the psyche, they also mirror the human body, the top being the head, the torso, and the legs of the body. This is a very, very old Kabbalistic teaching. We'll see why this is the case. What happens in the torso? What happens is our emotion, our heart is in the torso. And that's what happens once something is fully balanced between Chochma and Bina, between a flash of inspiration and a detailed analysis, we can then internalize that material and turn it into knowledge. Knowledge is when you've internalized the information and you've now been able to move it down into the emotion. And you're able to now to make that information a part of you, which, as we said, is why Daat and Keter cannot be simultaneous, because once we have that being moved down into the person, that information is now real. It's no longer conceptual. It's no longer abstract like Bina. It's no longer just a flash of inspiration which can come and go like Chochma. It's now real. It's now internalized. It's now deepened. And what happens is we cross this threshold to the next stage, which is the emotive stage. According to the Kabbalists as well, without throwing too much into this, there are 4 realms of being: Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, Asiya, and these are reflected by these four columns, which the sideways columns. So what happens is we move from the intellectual into the emotional, the internal. And the first step is on the right. Again, we begin with the right. We always begin with the right. We begin with Chesed. Chesed, loving kindness. Chesed is expansion, is giving, is just total saying yes to anything that comes. Chesed is, Abraham is called Chesed. Why? Because Abraham stood at the tent of his gate, stood at the gate of his tent, and just gave and gave and gave and gave. It didn't matter if he was sick, if he was old, if he was tired, if he just circumcised himself. Abraham was giving. That was his very essence. The Kabbalists say beautifully enough that while Abraham was alive, Chesed, the sphere of Chesed, the divine sphere of Chesed, which we see represented here, was on vacation. It was on paid leave. It was able to go to the Bahamas because Abraham was taking care of Chesed for the whole world. Chesed is give, yes, shower, it's expansion. Remember, the right channel is all about giving, it's about openness, letting things flow. That is the right side. If that's what Chesed is, its partner, Gevura. What's Gevura? Gevura's on the left. Gevura says no. Gevura says you cannot just give and give and give. What happens if you give and give and give in a relationship? There's nothing left. There's no respect. There's no boundaries. What happens if your child says, hey dad, hey mom, I want candy? Chesed says yes. Chesed always says yes. Chesed says give candy, give candy, give candy. Gevura says, the child is going to have no teeth left if all there is Chesed. Gevura says no. Gevura is restraint. Gevura is restriction. Gevura is boundaries. Gevura is rules. Gevura is the parent who grabs the hand of the child and yanks them away from the street and says, you cannot go on the street where there are cause. Gevura isn't mean. Gevura isn't vindictive. Gevura is boundaries, and boundaries are very important. Boundaries in self-expression. If we just all want to fully self-express and show the world who we are, run down the street naked, then we're going to very quickly get lucked away. But that's what Chesed wants to do. Chesed wants to be a nudist. Gevura says, no, no, no. Put a shirt on, get dressed. There are boundaries, there are rules, there's society. Gevura says, you cannot just share everything right away. Gevura says, give it bit by bit, or else if we go back to just being right channeled, we're going to have the same Shevira, the same shattering that we had in the first iteration of reality. Right and left. So we're beginning to understand the modalities, the texture, the flavor in right and left, to understand what they mean. Good. Now, what happens? So just like Chochma, Bina, on the intellectual level is emotional giving, intellectual inspiration, intellectual analysis. Emotional Chesed is an internal feeling of giving, of love, of just endless giving. Gevura says, hold back. What happens when the two of them have a good balance? They meet in the middle. They meet in Tiferet. Tiferet, beauty, harmony, compassion. Tiferet is when you found a balance between saying yes and naysaying. When you found a balance between free, fun, endless party and knowing when to call quits. Tiferet, I heard a great story actually by my teacher who taught me this He told me what Tiferet means, and I want to share the story with you. During the Great Depression, there was a woman in New York who was a single mother of many small children, and there was no food around. She had no income, and she went past the local bakery, and when no one was looking, she grabbed a loaf of bread to take home to her starving children, rightfully so. But as she was leaving, the baker caught her by the hand and said, "Excuse me, you're stealing. You're gonna have to come with me to court." And he drags her to the local sheriff, to the local police station, and they sit down. They very quickly sat down in front of a magistrate, in front of the judge. And the judge hears the case. There's this woman with starving children at home. She can't feed them. Everyone is starving. And how can he punish her? And then the baker says, "Excuse me, I have a business to run. I have children at home as well. If everyone just comes into free for all, if everyone just steals my bread, I'll go starving. Then there needs to be a way that I can make money. You can't just allow this to be a jungle." Chesed says, "What do you mean? Love, kindness, giving, share. Of course, you can't punish that woman," says Chesed. Gevura says, "No. Even at a time of chaos, can you imagine right now? We're living right now in an epidemic. If there was no rules, if there was no regulations, I don't know what's happening in South Africa, but thank God in Israel, there's no looting, there's no pillaging, there's no rioting. And that's because of Gevura. Gevura says even at tough times there has to be rules, and if you're breaking the rules, you're going to get arrested. You're going to be put in jail." Chesed says that's crazy. That's madness. You should unlock. You should just open your cash register. Let the poor people take. Chesed and Gevura cannot see eye to eye. Tiferet is what the judge did. The judge, and this is just fantastic. And this Tiferet is not negating either Chesed or Gevura. It's not listening to them. It's finding a place where they can both have their voices equally heard and equally shared in harmony. And Tiferet, the middle path, is very difficult. Mastering the middle path is really mastering the map of Kabbalah. It's really mastering this whole system. The judge hears both cases, and he neither penalizes the woman, and nor does he let the baker go unpaid. What he does is, everyone who was sitting in the courtroom, who was watching the proceedings, it was open to the public, he fined everyone in the room a small fine, 5 pence. What was the fine for? Why were they fined? They were fined for living in a city where a single widow woman would need to come to steal bread to feed her children. How can you live in such a city? How can you let that happen? You should have known about this. You should have done something about this. There should have been a space for her to have food without having to steal. Everyone in the courtroom was fined, and rightfully so. They were all paid a very small fine, and the collection of all of those little 5 cents, those 5 pence, paid up the full price of the loaf. The woman didn't have to pay. The baker got paid. That is Tiferet. That is true justice. That is compassion. That is the middle path. That's the balance. And finding Tiferet sometimes takes a stroke of genius for the judge to find a way that both of them could be found right, that both Chesed and Gevura could be treated correctly. It was a moment of genius, and that's what Tiferet calls for. Once Tiferet is fulfilled, we can then move down to the next level. The next level here, as we can see, is the expressive. It is the behavioral, whereas the first level was cognitive, the second level was emotional, the third level is now expressive. And it's where we're going to begin to see these emotions that have been working inside of us. The whole conflict between Chesed and Gevura and the reconciliation of Tiferet all happens inside our chest, inside our torso. That's where the Kabbalah is situated, according to Patach Eliyahu, as you mentioned. However, now we have the legs. The legs are where we begin to walk forward and we begin to express how we've been feeling inside. And in many ways, these three of Netzach, Chod, Yesod are a reflection of Chesed, Gevura, Tiferet, as these reflected the early stages of Chochma, Bina, Daat, just on the next level. Now, what is this next stage? Is everyone clear with Chesed, Gevura, Tiferet? Are we ready for Netzach, Chod, Yesod? Fantastic. Netzach literally is victory, but Netzach is not victory. Netzach, the translations are horrendous. Netzach is drive, ambition, the desire to win, the competitive spirit, the desire to conquer. And it's from the right side. The right, remember, is going out, is conquering, is aggressive, is out there, Netzach does not take no for an answer. Netzach is out there. Netzach is pushing forth, breaking down boundaries. Netzach is domination. Netzach is, and in our own expression, Netzach is when we are able to stand up for what we are passionate about, what we're interested in. We have a vision. You come to a project, you come to a creative project, and you have all other people that you're working with, and your Netzach is, I am going to get this done the way that I see it because I know that my vision is right, as it's being channeled effectively from Keser, Chochma, Bina, all the way through. That is Netzach in the creative sense. In the relational sense, Netzach, in every relationship, there needs to be a place, and these can alternate. These can be simultaneously both ways. But there needs to be someone who is in charge and someone who is receiving orders. There needs to be a balance. There needs to be a parent and a child. If parents act like children and children act like parents to one another, you're not going to have healthy families. Even in a teacher-student relationship, the teacher takes a position of Netzach. The teacher is sharing what they have to give, and the recipient is Hod. And we're going to understand these now in relation to one another. Hod, literally splendor, but Hod means submission. It means being content. It means a passivity. Whereas Netzach is driving forward, Hod, being on the left side, is about holding in, holding back. Hod tells us, the Kabbalists, when we map these Sefirot according to the millennia, each Sefirah is giving millennia. Netzach is during the time of David and Solomon, where Jews were conquering and they were taking up land and they were beating their enemies. Hod is when the temple was destroyed, where the Jews were outpowered by the Romans. They had to go down on one knee. Netzach is the left leg. Netzach is the knee that we kneel down on when we realize we're in over our heads, it's too much for us, when we submit. And the reason why this is so important is because in the relationship there needs to be a submission. A child needs to know that the parent knows more than them. A spouse needs to have a dynamic and a balance, and these can flip back and forth. At one point one can be, but if one is always, it's my way or the highway, if one is always driving their vision through, then they'll never get anything done. If one is making a creative process and one won't allow any other's voices to be heard, if they don't have a capacity to step back, to kneel down and hear someone else, then that's not going to work. If a student knows everything and they're Netzach and they're unbridled, right-sided passion and invigoration, they're never going to have the capacity to sit down and listen and learn something. Netzach is always coupled with Hod, and Hod is not a negative thing. Hod having a place to be humble, to listen, to be passive, is just as important as being active and being aggressive and being ambitious and being passionate. And I think what happens is you see people that manifest these personalities more in their lives. There are some people who are more Netzach personalities, who need to be doing something, who need to be achieving, who need to be, making news, need to be getting out there. Then they're the fire. And Hod is someone who is content, who knows how to be happy with what they have. Now, both of these taken without one another can lead to very bad places. And the point is, there needs to be a balance. Simply Netzach, you're going to burn out and have God forbid, you're going to end up in the gutter because you've been riding at 1,000 miles an hour and never knew when to stop. You're just going to simply, it's unfeasible, it's unattainable. You're going to burn out your partners, you're going to burn out your collaborators, you're going to burn out yourself. If one only has Hod, one is always happy, submissive, passive. No, it's fine. Let things be the way they are. You're going to be sitting down on your couch. The place is going to be overgrown. The bills won't be paid. Nothing will happen because you're Hod. You're in a place of humility, of submission, of stepping down. Hod and Netzach need to find a relationship and find a balance. And when they come together, they come to the middle path. And what happens in the middle path between Netzach and Hod? We have Yesod. Yesod literally is the foundation, because this is the foundation of relationship. It's the foundation of a self-expression. It's the foundation of any creative act. Yesod is better translated as bonding or intimacy, connection, union. Yesod is where, once we have found the perfect balance between Netzach and Hod, between knowing when to take charge and knowing when to let someone else take charge, in our interpersonal dynamics and in our interpersonal dynamics amongst us, inside ourselves, then we can have a connection, and we can both connect with ourselves. We can connect with the other person, because we know when we can step up and we can step down. We know, and we feel comfortable being humble, and we feel comfortable taking control. Then you have a capacity for Yesod, for connection, for intimacy, for union. And without that, there is no relationship. Without the capacity to have the balance, there is no connection. Yesod on the middle path is that point of connection. As we said, the Kabbalists map this throughout also onto the human body, and the Netzach being the right leg, Hod being the left leg, the Yesod is the reproductive organs, because that physically and biologically is where connection happens and connection takes place. And in this metaphor, taking it further, what happens after Yesod? After Yesod comes Malchut, and Malchut is in a very precarious position because it's actually not mirrored by any other Sefirot, as we've had earlier. It is just sort of hanging there on its own. And Malchut is a very bizarre Sefirah. And it's kind of bizarre like Keter, and there's good reason for that, and I'll explain to you in a second. So the way we're going to understand Malchut is firstly by identifying its position. Malchut is in the center beam, which we now that we have a taste for what the center column means, we know Malchut is a place of compromise, a place of hearing both sides, a place of balance, a place of shared, of openness to the two extremes of right and left. But Malchut is also underneath the final red line, which means it's now asiyah, it's now an act of creation, of expression. Malchut is given different metaphors by the Kabbalists, and we're going to rotate through those metaphors to try to explain what this final sphere is, and then we're going to reflect back on the full picture and explain this process, the flow process, spiritually and internally. Malchut is called the queen. Malchut is called the moon. Malchut is called the kingdom. Malchut is called speech. Malchut is called action. And these are just one of the many metaphors. The Kabbalists, they have this way of throwing metaphors at an idea, and they hope that the person can see what connects all these metaphors. What connects all of these ideas? The idea that connects them all is they are essentially on their own, they're empty. There's nothing in them. The moon on its own has no light. The moon reflects the sun's light. The king on its own, the king without a nation, is a guy in a costume, is a joke, is empty without the king. The metaphor of the queen or the female, the feminine, the womb without a male partner to inseminate, to bring life into it, is also empty, is not functioning. Malchut is a place of emptiness. It's a place of emptiness, but because it's a place of emptiness, emptiness by the Kabbalists is not a pejorative, is not a negative. It's a beautiful thing, because emptiness means there's now potential, there's now capability, there's now a fecundity, there's now a space for life. And what happens, that's precisely what happens with Malchut. Malchut sits at the bottom because Malchut receives all of the energy and all of the passion and all of the drive and all of the inspiration and all of the relation flows down to Malchut, and Malchut is where that can manifest. Malchut is the child which is born. Malchut is the word which is spoken. After all of the process goes through the mind and goes through the emotions, we can then say, I love you. We can then say, this needs to be done this way. We can then, Malchut is then the speech, because it is the final product. Malchut is also the action. Sometimes when we express ourselves, it's not with words, but it's with action. Malchut is the final finished product. If one has a full creative process and it comes out in a poem, in a painting, in a song, in a lecture, in a dance, that act of creation is Malchut. Malchut is the realm of reality that we live in, because this world is the final point, is the final manifestation of all of God's creative process and creative potencies. We live in Malchut. And the reason why Malchut and Keter are so similar, and this is going to like open the lid on the matrix here. The reason why Malchut and Keter are so similar is because this pattern repeats itself. And what happens is that Malchut, let me see if we could do this with the paper. Malchut becomes Keter of the next iteration, because this process, this cycle, doesn't happen once, it repeats itself. It repeats itself primarily 4 times, which the Kabbalists describe, reflecting the 4 worlds, but in an infinite amount of times, an infinite amount of iterations. And each sphere is reflected one within the other. So what happens is, in the next stage of reality, Malchut becomes Keter, which is why the Kabbalists call it sometimes Keter-Malchut. And funnily enough, Keter is the crown, Malchut is kingship. It's the king's crown. And what happens is the recipient becomes the giver, the recipient, the action, the final deed, the final manifestation becomes the new Keter to inspire the next thing. So if one has a finished project, a finished artwork, a finished relationship where it's manifests beautifully, they themselves can see that, or someone else can see that, and that becomes their inspiration to give birth to their reprocessing. It's a new Keter, which is born from the Malchut, which then flows back into Chochma, Bina, Daat. So, if I can make a request, it's teaching to a camera is something which I'm becoming used to now because I'm teaching online. But there's something which is really lacking, which is interaction. So if I can beg whoever is interested to think about what we went through and to write down any questions, any points which they want clarified, any things which was not clear, anything needs to be repeated, anything which they felt that I said that was wrong, they're welcome to challenge and give alternative explanations. But questions are so important in teaching. So it would be really very, very precious to me if people would, and I would even dedicate the next session just to clarifying and just to, because I mean, there are things which I'm interested in and passionate about and I can talk about for a long time, but I want to know what you guys want to hear. I want to know what you guys found interesting here and what we can pick apart more. And there's a tremendous amount to pick apart. And just thank you to everyone that came and listened and that gave the time to learn and to explore. So thank you for your interest and for your curiosity and for your passion, and may we continue to be passionate, and may we keep seeking after God and after the unity. That's ultimately the hope for this time. Pleasure. Thank you.